Welcome to Aporia Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Winkler. In this program, I wanted to have conversations with some of today's leading minds in the field of philosophy to discuss ideas in a way that would be compelling for specialists, but also encourage interest for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the subject. To do this, I thought it best to not only talk about theory, but explore what really drives today's philosophers' curiosity and passion to research, teach, and write. On today's episode, we'll be joined by Professor Della Rocca of Yale University. Currently holding the position of the Sterling Professorship of Philosophy, Michael is one of today's leading minds in the field. He has authored 3 groundbreaking books, 2 on 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, titled Representation and the Mind-Body Problem in Spinoza from 1996, and Spinoza from 2008, along with one on ancient philosopher Parmenides, among others, titled The Parmenidean Ascent from 2020. He is also the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Spinoza from 2013 and the author of numerous articles on contemporary thought and the history of philosophy, making him one of the field's most prolific authors. In this episode, we'll discuss his major sources of inspiration in thinkers like Spinoza, Parmenides, along with British idealist F.H. Bradley, along with his major contributions to the discussion of ideas like the principle of sufficient reason and radical monism. I'm very grateful for his generosity in joining for today's episode of Aporia. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Della Rocca to the podcast. Professor Della Rocca, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Thank you again for joining for the podcast. You are a professor at Yale University. You've been teaching philosophy, writing about philosophy for many, many years. I was really curious about where it began for you. And first off, from the perspective of texts, many people speak about like that one work that really captivated them and initiated them into philosophy. Was there a particular work or set of works that were important for you?
That's an interesting question because, I've been thinking about this and looking back, one thing that was really important for me, although I didn't realize it at the time, was studying geometry in high school. And so not that we read Euclid's Elements, but we read some geometry textbook. And the ability to put together logical arguments and these kinds of deductions in geometry, I really, really enjoy that. And I didn't realize I was doing a kind of philosophy, but that is a kind of philosophy. So I think that was something I found that I enjoyed and was good at. And so that had a big influence. And if we can talk about high school again for a sec, I had a great time in high school, but it was a Catholic high school. And so there's a lot of religion and theology thrown in there, but it was philosophy by another name. Theological parts of it no longer resonate with me, but the philosophical parts do. And I remember one book that one of my theology teachers gave me to read was on existentialism, a popular book called Irrational Man. I read this book avidly in high school, and I'm sure I didn't understand most of it. It was on Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and the other existentialists, and Heidegger, but I really enjoyed it, and that really made a mark on me. And in college, the first 2 books that really engaged with me were Spinoza's Ethics, which I read for the first time in this early modern survey course, similar to the one I'm going to teach this semester. Yeah. And then I also came across in another course, Bergson's Creative Evolution. That really I found very engaging too. And I've often wished I had kept up my interest in Bergson. I think it's been in the background for a lot of what I do, but I've never really returned to it in as much depth.
In Spinoza, was it a meeting of this geometry and of Irrational Man coming together in one place?
Well, the geometrical method, I think I found now, looking back, I realized that was one of the things that appealed to me about Spinoza was ambition to present his philosophy in geometrical form. I thought that was a great ambition to have. I never really thought of Spinoza as kind of an existentialist, although a lot of my interpretation of Spinoza more recently has gone in that direction in terms of focusing on what the nature of being is.
I've always been fascinated by Deleuze, and to understand Deleuze, I've had to go to Bergson because that's sort of where he's just wonderful. Read The Creative Mind, which is this collection of essays.
Yes.
And I'm working through this other collection of essays, Mind Energy.
Yes, I know that. The Creative Mind was a good collection for me too. It has a short essay, Introduction to Metaphysics, I think is in there. And there's also a short essay, Intuition or Philosophical Intuition. And it talks about the nature of intuition there. This is one of the places where he engaged with Spinoza a bit, a short essay. Spinoza has this kind of imposing geometrical apparatus in his philosophy. And it intimidates people, he says. But he says we must get behind that, behind the geometrical method, as Wolfson would put it. We must get behind that and try to find the intuition that's driving Spinoza's philosophy.
Yes.
And I think that showed a real appreciation by Bergson for what's going on in Spinoza and the importance of approaching the history of philosophy in a certain way, trying to capture what's animating a philosopher's thought. Bergson did that very well, something that I aspire to.
Yeah, that inner impetus of a thought and separate from the apparatus through which it's communicated.
That's right.
That's maybe is a good place to ask about, when did you know that you wanted to study philosophy? You had these other interests in that. Was it a single moment, a gradual process, first to major and then to have a career in philosophy?
I think just the slight acquaintance I had in philosophy in high school primed me for doing philosophy in college. And when I entered college, I wasn't set on majoring in philosophy, but it was one of the options. And I took courses in my first semester in college. They were taught by wonderful professors, and that sort of confirmed in my mind that I wanted to do this. And to major in philosophy, in terms of deciding to pursue philosophy as a career, I never really fully decided to do that. I made the decision to try to go to graduate school, but even then I wasn't set on a philosophical career. But what helped me to decide to go to graduate school was completing my senior thesis, which was on Spinoza, actually. And that I found to be a really challenging and rewarding experience. And then that encouraged me to consider this as an option. I loved working on the senior thesis. I took a year off before going to graduate school, and I wasn't entering graduate school with the intention of working on Spinoza. But then I took a break from Spinoza for a while, but then I came back to him.
Spinoza is, in your thought, he seems to be this wellspring of ideas.
Yes.
And I gather from your other research, this rationalist tradition. And in some ways, as I understand it, you describe Parmenides also as something of a rationalist in your recent book. Could you tell me what about this approach to philosophy, this approach to life that you find is such a rich area of exploring, and how it's helped you?
For me, Spinoza and Parmenides, what I really like about both of them is they are rationalists. They always demand an explanation for any given fact or thing, however you want to put it. So there's a kind of strong commitment to rationalism in both of them. And I thought why that appeals to me is that it's always looking for the explanations and never being willing to settle for something just because it's a convenient thought or a comfortable thought. We always want to dig, perhaps in an annoying fashion, always asking why. So my family has to tolerate this sometimes. But that kind of commitment to explanation, I think, is one of the things that really attracted me to Spinoza. Interest in Parmenides came much later. Only recently through my teaching at Yale did I really first think about and work on Parmenides. But for both of them, it's this uncompromisingness of their commitment to rationalism. So you get a lot of more tepid forms of rationalism in various strands in philosophy, but I think you get some in a particularly pure form of rationalism, I think, in both Parmenides and in Spinoza. And I also think that that's true of Bradley as well. So Bradley is one of the big three for me. He too has this uncompromising rationalism. It's not often how he's read, but I think one can make a case for that.
This comes in opposition to something like an intuition or a faith. Reason for you is very much the causal explanations of things.
That's right. So I think one of the things that I really like about Spinoza and Parmenides is that they're not fans of common sense. And for me, common sense has no inherent authority at all. It's just another opinion. A lot of times philosophers, especially nowadays, tend to defer to common sense or tends to defer to intuition. Intuitions and common sense are not quite the same thing. But in either case, I think intuitions and common sense are both fallible. So they're given authority. Philosophers tend to defer to intuitions and common sense, but I don't think they're worthy of that authority and worthy of that deference. What I really like about Parmenides and Spinoza is that they're not beholden to common sense. They're willing to be radical, in other words, and not be conservative.
Conceptually, consistent themes that appear in your work are the principle of sufficient reason and the radical monism, among other things. But I was just wondering if you could, for the listeners, explain what are those two ideas?
So the principle of sufficient reason, and it's a term introduced by Leibniz in philosophy, but I see it as it work from Parmenides through to the current day in one form or another. And that principle is just to claim that each fact has an explanation. Each thing that's true can be explained. Or another way to put it, each thing has an explanation. Each thing can be explained. It's a commitment to the intelligibility. Each thing can be explained, it can be made intelligible. It's not to say necessarily that the explanation of a given thing is going to be accessible to any particular individual, but that it's to claim that each thing in principle has an explanation and can be made intelligible to a sufficiently discerning intellect. Maybe not our own intellect, but it can be made intelligible. That's the principle of sufficient reason, or the PSR. One of my articles, I think it's the shortest title for an article in philosophy. Maybe it's one of the shortest. It's just PSR. And that's that principle. Everything has an explanation. Monism, that comes in a lot of varieties. It's just the PSR comes in a lot of strength too. And some people think that they have limited forms of the PSR. For example, in Kant, he loves the PSR, but in a limited fashion, the PSR only applies within the realm of possible experience. To go outside of experience, the PSR is not applicable. And there are other philosophers who limit the PSR in other ways. And then with monism, you have weaker or stronger versions of monism. So monism is just oneism. It's the view that in its most radical form, there's only one thing. I have a view which might be seen as more radical. There are no distinctions. That is the strongest form of monism, is that there are no distinctions. Then you have the view that there's only one thing, you can count it and it's one. And then you have other forms of monism which says, well, there's lots of multiplicity in the world, lots of different things, but there's only one fundamental thing. And that one fundamental thing is the cosmos itself. It's more fundamental in the sense that you can explain everything else in terms of the cosmos. Everything within the cosmos can be explained by the cosmos. So that's a form of monism too. So that's far too weak for my, I mean, some philosophers have adopted that view. Jonathan Schaffer in some lovely papers has advanced that view, and I think it's great, but it doesn't go far enough. The view that there's exactly one thing might seem to be a very strong form of monism, but it doesn't go far enough too, because the view that there are no distinctions, that goes further in a sense. The problem with the view that there's only one thing is that to count something, even to count to one, is to implicitly appeal to the possibility of several, right? And so if you're really strong monist, you don't think that there's one thing, you think there's not a possibility of more than one thing. And then that would really eliminate the use of the count noun such as one. I prefer the view that there are no distinctions whatsoever. That's the more radical claim that I try to defend in my recent book. Those are monism and the PSR in their various strengths. And for me, these are connected because I think, and this is not original to me, although not everyone sees this, but I think that the PSR entails monism. The PSR is true, monism is true. And to flip it, this is the equivalent claim. If monism is false, if there's multiplicity of things, then there has to be a violation of the PSR. The PSR would be false. I call this the PSR monism express. If you accept the PSR, be careful because it leads to monism. That kind of conditional, that connection between the PSR and monism, I think Parmenides sees this. I think Spinoza sees this. I think Bradley sees this. And all three of them accept the PSR, so they accept the monism. I think the connection between the PSR and monism is something that Hume appreciates. Hume is not a rationalist. He rejects PSR. In fact, he has an argument against the PSR. He's not a rationalist. That's great. But he sees the connection between the PSR and monism. And the reason he rejects the PSR is that he sees that the PSR would lead to monism. But he hates monism. He's an atomist, or he's committed to multiplicity. So he sees that he has to reject the PSR. But Hume agrees if PSR is true, then monism is true. So Hume he understands rationalism perhaps better than some rationalists do. This is one reason why, for me, Hume is in the pantheon as well as Parmenides, Spinoza, and Bradley. He sees that connection, and he sees what one has to do if one wants to avoid monism, namely one has to deny the PSR, which is in fact exactly what Hume does.
This is to say that if there are no real distinctions between anything, so there is no difference, as it were, between you and I, between others, between us and the earth, or anything else in the cosmos, but also not just at the same time, but across time as well. There is no distinction between past, present, and future. You mentioned in your recent book, Parmenidean Ascent, that many people are very unsympathetic to this view and perhaps find it hard to wrap their minds around. First off, why do you think that is? And I have a few other questions about people's reactions to it.
Partly because it goes against our ordinary ways of thinking. It goes against common sense. It goes against our intuitions, our philosophical intuitions, perhaps. I think that philosophers, as most other people, are inherently conservative, not necessarily in a political sense, although this is related to political conservatism, but it's in a sense that people don't like upheaval. They don't like, they're resistant to change. And this is a natural thing. But I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of philosophers resist the idea of radical monism, and perhaps also resist the idea of a strong form of the PSR, because they see in one way or another, as Hume did, that the PSR leads to monism. I think that kind of conservatism is one reason. As I mentioned before, this deference to common sense, which I think methodologically a big problem in contemporary philosophy, particularly in contemporary analytic philosophy, where there's this real deference to common sense in a way that I think is contrary to what the nature of philosophy is and should be. That should be just a spirit of total exploration, being willing to dig and dig and dig, looking for explanations. And this bedrock intuitions or common sense that a lot of philosophers rest with, I think, is contrary to the spirit of philosophy, and I think accounts for a lot of the resistance to some of the things I argue. I mean, I do have arguments for this kind of monism, and I invite philosophers to engage in these arguments. A lot of the arguments are in the form of what's called Bradley's regress. So we can talk about that if you like, but there's a kind of regress argument that shows that whenever you have two things that stand in a relation, they're distinct, but there's no good way to explain the relation between any two things. And the problem is that either you get into an infinite regress, or there's a kind of circularity, which also is inimical to our explanatory endeavors. So there's a problem of making sense of relations. So it's a problem of making sense of distinctions, because if two things are distinct, they stand in a relation. There are no distinctions because there are no relations. And so this is, the arguments lead, these kinds of rationalist arguments, they lead to this rejection of distinctions and to radical form of monism. I think these are very powerful arguments. And sometimes I present various aspects of my system, and they're all controversial. And I do get a lot of resistance, and I get nervous if people aren't resisting. I want to really engage at that level. But sometimes I get audiences who, while they are not convinced by the conclusion, they see what I'm trying to do, and they try to offer other ways to reach a similar conclusion. They're taking it seriously. That's actually the kind of response I like best.
As I understand it, the argument is that relations, differences cannot be accounted for by the principle of sufficient reason. And if the relations can't be accounted for, therefore the distinctions between things fall away as well.
That's right. That's exactly right.
I find this idea of the dissolving the distinctions between things very interesting. One of the things that has always, with Parmenides, with Spinoza, and so on, that I struggle with is that of, if there are no real distinctions, then what is the explanation for the phenomena or the appearance of distinction?
This is a challenge that comes up right in Parmenides, because he has the first part of his poem, after the introduction of the poem, the first part is this, the way of truth, and then there's the way of opinion, or the way things seem to people. And he tries to give an account of why things seem where they are. But there's always the question, why do things seem to be multiple? I think really it has to be that the appearance of multiplicity is a kind of confusion. This, I think, is really in common also between Parmenides, Spinoza, and Bradley. It's a confusion on our part. If we saw things clearly, then there would be no appearance of distinctions at all. It's even hard to articulate this position, and this is part of the resistance, because even to articulate this position that there are no distinctions, I articulated this with a sentence just now. The subject to the sentence is a predicate in this, and this kind of complexity in the sentence. So even to articulate the position, it seems to undermine the position. People are wary of that.
I'm reminded as well of a man who's a Vietnamese monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, who talked a lot about mindfulness, meditation, deep thinking. A lot of these meditative experiences led him to this intuition of there being no difference of time, no differences
Yeah.
of before and after, and differences between things. And he gives this wonderful example of a cloud and then a rainfall, and longing for the cloud that was there before the rain fell. And he said, when we learn to really think deeply, we see that the cloud didn't disappear, that in the raindrops, the cloud is still present. And I wonder if your thinking very much emphasizes the principle of sufficient reason, rationality, but is there a meditative dimension that goes along with that, or those two perhaps go together?
I think they do go together.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I come at this from the point of view of an analytical philosopher. So that's my training. But it's interesting that what I'm trying to do is to use the methods of analytical philosophy in order to raise a challenge to the kinds of distinctions that analytical philosophy and other forms of philosophy trade upon. And in the end, what I'm trying to do is undermine analytical metaphysics. Metaphysics is ordinarily understood. But also, I think the PSR undermines itself. The PSR understood in a certain way might be seen to presuppose distinctions, because just to say that everything has an explanation, if the explanation is something that stands in relation to the thing explained, perhaps some other thing, or perhaps the thing itself. But if this kind of, if explanation is a relation and relations are problematic, then the PSR itself, in its very demand for explanation, which presupposes a relation, would undermine itself. By undermining relations, it undermines itself. Part of my project is to show how there's an internal incoherence in lots of different domains in philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, theory of meaning, philosophy of action. But as one of my last acts is to undermine the PSR itself. And I think it's a troubling outcome, perhaps, but in a way entirely appropriate, because what we're trying to get away from is this notion of relational explanation. One of the chapters in my book is called The Joy of Self-Undermining. For me, the way in which this demand for explanation, the PSR, undermines lots of philosophy and then undermines itself is a feature, not a bug, precisely because it's at such a fundamental level. There's no independent way to get a purchase on it.
This is where you use the metaphor of the ladder that you have to discard, right? Yes.
And it's not my metaphor, of course. It's from Wittgenstein. But also it goes back to Sextus Empiricus, ancient skeptical philosopher. He uses a similar line of argument to show that his kind of skeptical arguments undermine everyone's claim to any particular claim, but also undermine themselves. Skeptical arguments undermine themselves. In a similar way that I think Parmenides' monism, which is a rejection of distinctions, his statement of that in his poem undermines itself, because the poem has a beginning, a middle, and an end, or whatever. And I think that's what's going on in Bradley. Reason undermines itself, and Spinoza never puts it this way, but in a way Spinoza's committed to this kind of self-undermining too. But for me, that's a good part. I mean, that it shows it's a critique of relational thinking. Some kind of rationality might remain, but it can't be relational, because that can't be explained.
When I think of reasoning through this dissolution of differences, I think of something like a greater harmony between people and the earth. But what I'm also interested in is that in your thinking, those things disappear as well. Like, how do we relate to those differences now?
We can't have the full vision where there's distinctions at all, right? In a way, things like the table, the chair, my laptop, you and me, we normally conceive of those things as differentiated from other things. So according to this extreme rationalist philosophy and monist philosophy, those things don't exist as differentiated from other things. We think of them, and that's how we conceive of you and me and of the laptop as differentiated, but that's an incoherent conception. The reality that we're trying to conceive when we conceive of the laptop or of you or me or the table, that reality is better conceived not in terms of the laptop or you and me, but in terms of being itself, without differentiation. This view does have a way of bringing us together, because we're really just the same as being itself. There's really no genuine distinction between you and being itself, and this kind of oneness with being. This is sounding kind of mystical here. I get nervous. But I think this kind of philosophical system lends itself to certain mystical thoughts. What I'm trying to do is to show how using reason, which is usually seen as inimical to mysticism, actually, when taken to its extreme, this rationalist thought in terms of PSR leads to something like the mystical thoughts where we have united with the universe. One thing that I didn't do in the book was ethics. I applied it to philosophy of language and theory of knowledge and of substance in general, but I didn't apply it to ethics. So I wanted to do that right. And that's part of what I'm working on now. It's emphasis on the notion of good and of oneness of all, which is a good thing.
It makes sense that it would lead to a discussion of ethics. I wonder how it has affected your view of the practice of writing about philosophy.
Yeah. Chapter 12 is a blank page. That chapter is called Tractatus Parmenido Philosophicus,
right.
which is sort of a play on Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, the logical philosophical treatise. That title in Wittgenstein is derived from Spinoza, actually. Spinoza wrote a work in political philosophy called the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, theological political treatise. And so it thought it was neat that Wittgenstein has a play on the Spinoza's title. So this is connection with Spinoza here. And not that Wittgenstein, who's still in his 20s, wrote the Tractatus, was not aware of, I'm sure, of Spinoza's writing, but G.E. Moore suggested that title to him. That title of my chapter 12 is in a way an allusion to the end of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, where he says there, look, I've been asserting some propositions all throughout this book, but really in some way they're nonsense. But we use these nonsensical claims that I've been making to ascend to a certain position. We climb up a ladder and then we throw away the ladder, and then we can see the world aright. That's what I'm suggesting, is that we're making a kind of ascent, the Parmenidean Ascent in the book. I've been using the PSR, appealing to explanations, to try to knock out certain other kinds of philosophical positions. But strictly, all those attempts at explanation or engagement with people's positions, all those attempts are relational. And so they're just a ladder that I was climbing up. But at the end, I realized that these are incoherent arguments. So I kick away the ladder, and then I will see the world aright. And what I see in this chapter 12 is a blank page, a world without distinctions. It's not an empty world. It's a world full, but not containing any distinctions. It's being itself. But we can't fully achieve this, because the chapter itself indicates. And chapter 13 is just called the Parmenidean Ascent, because once we make this Parmenidean Ascent, we can see the world aright. And for me, that means we can do things just as we always did, say the kinds of things we always would say, but we have to abandon this realist metaphysics, which has an import between our beliefs and the world, a relation between the beliefs and the world. We have to give up this kind of realism where there's a world that's independent of our minds. So we can go back and do everything we always did before, but without commitment to any metaphysical realism. And that's why we end the book with the sentence that I started the book with. But it's just a part of the sentence of the beginning of the book. And it's a fragment of the sentence, of the first sentence that begins the book. And that's important, because we can still say the same things, but we have to realize that what we're saying are these, insofar as we actually say something, it's going to be incoherent. Our thoughts are just fragmented thoughts. The only non-fragmented thought is the thought of the whole, which is expressed to some extent in chapter 12. Chapter 13 is just a fragmentary thought that we've always had, and we return to our usual experiences.
It's very interesting, your emphasis on the process of this, because what I understand is that it's not enough to take this idea, there are no distinctions, and that's it. It's really necessary to go through the principle of sufficient reason and for oneself struggle with this to come to the other side.
Yeah. Right. What way I put it is that's exactly right. You have to earn the right to affirm the monist positions, to make the Parmenidean Ascent. You have to earn the right. In a way, where I wind up with is in a position that's like the later Wittgenstein, where he abandons metaphysics and is no longer making metaphysical distinctions. And that's where I wind up in the recent book too. But I earned the right to get there, and I'm using rationalist metaphysics to undermine, and realist metaphysics to undermine rationalist and realist metaphysics themselves. And that's how I earned the right to do that. So it is a process, and it's something that everyone has to go through for themselves, as it were, in making this what I call the Parmenidean Ascent.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. That ends the discussion of principle of sufficient reason, Parmenides. I wanted to close out with just a couple of questions on where next for you. Are you currently reading any works that you find especially inspiring, giving you some new, I know you talked about ethics, but any other directions as well?
Yeah, so ethics is the main direction I want to continue this project in critiquing current accounts of normativity. I'm reading a lot of things, but one of the things I've been reading lately is Christine Korsgaard's book on sources of normativity, and lots of her other writings too, which is just, they're wonderful. I totally disagree with the positions because
Right.
she's committed to lots of distinctions, lots of relations that I think are incoherent. But I think she makes a very compelling, in a way, case, which is really so beautifully structured case for a Kantian moral philosophy that involves the notion of duties and the moral distinctions that I think have to be rejected. But she does the best job I think there is articulating this view. So I really admire a lot of what she's written. That's something else, and that I'm by no means an expert. I've been reading Nagarjuna. He's a Buddhist philosopher. One work is pretty short. It's challenging, but it's called the Dispeller of Disputes. And so it's very dialectical. It's a combination of skepticism and also, I think, a kind of monism as well. That's a really neat combination for me. So Nagarjuna is someone whose works that I'm reading. And I think, so you mentioned some non-Western thinkers before, and I think this is, this I think is, I'm working my way toward this and trying to understand that connection better. Someone else I've been reading a lot is Sextus Empiricus. I mentioned him.
Right.
So he has a radical skeptical philosophy, and he's challenging our ordinary ways of thinking. But it is the kind of underlying PSR that's driving his skeptical arguments. And that's, I think, is going on in Nagarjuna as well as Sextus. And so I'm reading them from that point of view. And then one other just thing that I've been reading is Don Garrett's book on Hume. It's a lovely book, and I'm writing a paper on Spinoza and Hume, and I'm finding Don's book very helpful. And just to come full circle, Don was, when I first took a Spinoza seminar in college, Don was the teacher of that seminar 40 years ago. It's nice to visit his book on Hume.
That's maybe a good place to bring one last question here is,
yes.
What bit of advice would you offer to young philosophers trying to find their way?
Be radical. Don't defer to common sense. And if you have this kind of hunch that there's some kind of radical position might be correct, then pursue that hunch. It's worth taking radical views seriously. The more we defer to common sense, the less philosophical we're being, I think.
Professor Michael Della Rocca, it was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to join for the podcast, and really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean.
We hope that you enjoyed this first episode of Aporia Podcast. On the next episode, we'll continue the conversation with Professor Brad Stone of Loyola Marymount University to discuss his research on 20th century continental European philosophy along with American pragmatism. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.